Hello, my name is Stephen Lim. Thank you very much for joining me. Today, I'd like to talk about a study I conducted as to how teachers use one-to-one devices in the classroom. Now, one-to-one devices means that each student has access to a computer or a tablet. And why is this important? Well, one-to-one device programs are becoming more and more ubiquitous around the world. However, a lot of the teachers who are expected to implement this ICT or information communication technology have not been trained as to how to do so, nor given strong guidelines. So I wanted to follow two teachers over the course of a year to see how they use these devices in their classroom, what they thought of them, and what their students thought of them. So to give you a little context, this study was done in Japan. And in March 2021, the GigaSchool program was launched. In the GigaSchool program, the Japanese government provided one device, be it a Chromebook or a tablet, for each student in compulsory education. Now, this was a pretty radical step considering that Japan has a really poor track record when it comes to ICT in education. In fact, they ranked last amongst the OECD in 2018. But this also represented a huge opportunity for change, not only in terms of ICT, but in terms of the educational approach. Japan has traditionally favored a teacher-centered approach. However, technology can facilitate a learner-centered approach. Students have access to the internet and to functions that they would not otherwise have without these computers. So they can really regulate and foster their own development. However, it's important to note that a lot of research has also shown that one-to-one devices just enhance traditional teacher-centered instruction. So I was certainly interested to see whether these computers would lead to a learner-centered approach or a teacher-centered approach. So bearing all this in mind, I wanted to know how the teachers would utilize these devices and how this would change over the course of the year. And since the teachers had not received much training as to how to use these devices, I thought it would be very unlikely that there was a standard approach for their usage. I also wanted to see how the students perceive these one-to-one devices and how the fact that the teachers would use these devices in different ways meant that the students might perceive them in different ways too. So the two participants in this study that were teachers had taken part in a previous study of mine. And the previous study was in regards to teacher preconceptions about technology. And amongst all the participants in that study, these teachers stood out because, well, you can see there's such a vast difference, not only in their backgrounds, but also their attitudes towards technology. Senna is a far less experienced teacher who has a far more positive approach to technology, and she had received a very small amount of training into how to use these devices. Makiko, on the other hand, is a much more experienced teacher who has a far more negative view of technology, and she had received no training whatsoever. So I thought it'd be very interesting to compare the two. Now, thankfully, their situations were quite similar. They both taught Year 8 public junior high school students, and they both started using these devices in September 2021. As you can see, there are slightly different student numbers. This is because Senna was teaching 5 classes and Makiko was teaching 4. There were 3 data gathering points, one at the end of each semester over the course of a year. So I used 3 different methods of collecting the data. For the students, they had a 12 Likert scale item questionnaire, and then they had to answer 2 open-ended questions. Whereas I conducted semi-structured interviews with the teachers after each semester to find out how they'd use these devices and any observations they'd made. So first, let's look at the Likert scale questionnaire. The framework I used was based on Davis's widely used TAM. or technology acceptance model. And Davis determined that users' perceptions of the usefulness and ease of use of a device would determine how willing they were to adopt the technology. But I also wanted to include Moon and Kim's perceived playfulness, because the students were not ultimately the ones to determine whether they'd be using the devices. So I thought it was important to find out how enjoyable it was for them to use the devices. So there were 3 constructs: usefulness, ease of use, and attitude, and 4 questions to measure those constructs. So students would respond to a positive statement written in Japanese. For example, "It's fun for me to use Chromebooks to study English." And they chose a number from 1 to 6. 1 meant they strongly disagreed with the statement, and 6 meant they strongly agreed with the statement. So here are some examples of the statements regarding the 3 constructs. First, usefulness, ease of use, and attitude. Let's take a look at the results. First, Sena's students. So remember that Sena is the more inexperienced but more tech-positive teacher. And the first thing to note is that on a 6-point scale, these results are pretty positive. The blue line, attitude, is particularly high, with orange, usefulness, and grey, ease of use, a little bit lower. And you'll notice the results somewhat peak in the second semester. Let's find out why that may be the case. So, how did Sena use these devices? Well, initially, she used Google Forms mainly to check comprehension of reading, but she also checked grammar quizzes as well. So students could choose their response by touching the screen, and they'd get instant feedback as to whether they were right or wrong. And then near the end of the semester, she started using Nearpod. If you're not familiar with Nearpod, it's a gamified learner management system. And students can take part in games and activities in which they compete simultaneously. And there are also collaborative aspects to it too. Well, in the second semester, she continued to use Google Forms and used Nearpod to a greater extent than she had in the first semester. She also started to use Jamboard. Jamboard is like a group whiteboard. Groups of students can contribute to the same online whiteboard, which is shared between them. So her students used Jamboard in order to create presentations as a group and then give those presentations to the rest of the class. So it was a good way to foster group work at what was the height of pandemic restrictions. So it would have been very difficult for them to work as a group otherwise. And near the end, she let them use Flipgrid once. Flipgrid is a video recording and editing software. So the students recorded self-introductions and then edited them to make them look much prettier. So how did she use them in the third semester? She didn't. This was quite a shock to me, but there were a number of factors which determined why she didn't use the devices. One of them was that there was a new teacher at the school, and she split the grade between her classes and the other teachers' classes. And the new teacher did not know how to use these devices at all. The 2 teachers wanted to standardize their approach. So as a result, Sena decided not to use the devices. It's interesting to note, though, that Sena mentioned she wasn't intending to use the devices as much in the third semester. In the second semester, she used these devices in 75% of her classes. So it was a lot. But by the third semester, the students were in the first semester of the last year of junior high school. So she was worried about preparing them for the high-stakes high school entrance examinations. Okay, next let's look at Makiko and her students. How did her students feel about these devices? If you remember, Makiko is the more experienced teacher who was less enthusiastic about using technology in her classes. And you'll probably notice the trajectory of the lines is very different to Sena's students. However, if you put them side by side, actually by the end of the third semester, The results are almost identical. The only difference is that Makiko students perceive the devices to be more useful than Sena students do. So let's take a look at why this may be the case. Well, in the first semester, Makiko used the Google Translate function in order to allow students to translate the textbook. So for homework, the students would have to translate a passage in the textbook, and if they didn't understand anything, they could use Google Translate to help them. And her students also had to make a solo presentation using Google Slides. The students researched a famous person using the internet on their Chromebook, and then they made slides, and then they gave a presentation to the rest of their class. In the second semester, she continued to use Google Translate, but she expanded the scope of how the students could use it. So in addition to the textbook, they also were allowed to use Google Translate to help them with writing. She started giving them more English composition questions, and the students could use Google Translate to look up words or grammar points which they hadn't learned yet. So usually students were restricted to the vocabulary and the grammar that they had learned in the textbook. Google Translate could be used to allow them to write things they wanted to write but didn't necessarily know how to do so. And in terms of reading as well, Makiko started giving them reading passages which weren't just from the textbook, because she reasoned that if they came across the word they didn't know, they could use Google Translate to help them to understand the passage. In the third semester, again, she allowed the students to use Google Translate. She also tried using Nearpod once or twice, and then she started doing a PowerPoint review. So at the end of each lesson, she would put her PowerPoints into a shared Google Drive, and her PowerPoints would usually explain a grammar point or explain some vocabulary or examples of how to use that vocabulary or grammar point. And the students would be able to review these PowerPoints on their own time. So they were expected to look over the PowerPoints again at home to make sure they'd understood the contents of the lesson. So it's interesting to note, again, as I mentioned, that by the end of the third semester, the students were almost identical in terms of their perception regarding the attitude and ease of use of these devices. The only notable difference was the fact that Makiko students thought the devices were more useful than Sena students did. Next, let's take a look at the open-ended questions. And first, the students were asked to write what points they liked about using the Chromebooks in English lessons. So I looked at all their answers and I coded them with QDA Minor Lite and categorized them into 3 constructs: attitude, ease of use, and usefulness. So if the students wrote about games, how much they enjoyed playing games, that would go under attitude. If they wrote about how easy it was to interact with the devices, that would go under ease of use. And if they wrote about the affordances that these devices allowed them, what they could do using these computers that they couldn't do with only pen and paper, that would go under usefulness. So the percentage of positive comments they wrote, for Sena students on the left-hand side, they wrote mainly about their positive feelings towards the devices as well as how useful they were. But Makiko students wrote predominantly about how useful these devices were. Now let's take a look a little bit more specifically at the kind of comments they wrote. Sena students, the number 1 comments were about the games, how they enjoyed playing the games in the classroom, and also how fun these devices were. And you can see from their comments that a lot of them enjoyed the fact that they could interact with these devices by just touching the screen. Now, this may look that students are being lazy and they don't want to write. However, it's important to remember that for students who are not very good at writing, it's kind of a barrier of entry for them to participating in the English lesson. So by allowing them to study English through touch, it's really making the whole experience less stressful and more fun for them. And that's something that Senna noted in an interview as well, that in particular, the lower level students really enjoyed using these devices. Makiko's students had very different responses. The number one comment which came up was about how useful it was to have the translate function. And the second most common response was about how these devices facilitated autonomy, how the students had more control over their learning process. So these are some of the comments that Makiko's students wrote. And again, you'll notice these are about autonomy. Now, if you look at the third comment, you can listen to the pronunciation of words as many times as you want. This is a good example of how useful these devices are. In a normal lesson, students don't have that many opportunities to listen to a word. They might get to hear it 3 or 4 times through listen and repeat. However, if they wanted to check by themselves, they would only have the teachers saying the words to hear them. However, using these computers, they can listen to them as many times as they want. The pace of the lesson is something that without these computers, students can't control. However, with them, they can control their own learning. And that's something that Makiko also highlighted in an interview with her. The second open-ended question was about what students disliked about using these devices. And this time the 3 constructs were attitude, difficulty of use, and the disadvantages of using these devices compared to traditional pen and paper methods. So if students talked about how they couldn't focus in the lessons, that would go under attitude. If they wrote about how difficult it was to use these devices, that would go under difficulty of use. And if they talked about how these devices were less useful than traditional methods for studying English, that would go under disadvantages. So looking at the percentage of negative comments, this time it's a little bit more similar. Difficulty in use, disadvantages were the 2 most frequently occurring ones. Although you'll notice that Makiko's students, there were more negative attitudes towards the devices than Senna's students. Let's have a look at Senna's students first though. And their number 1 negative comments was about how difficult it was to type. This is very understandable if you remember that Japanese students are not used to using ICT in education, and many of the students didn't have their own computers. So they're not familiar with typing in Japanese, let alone English. Hence, it's very slow for them to type. But the second thing they complained about the most was the study method. And you'll see from the student comments that by interacting through touch, they felt that their writing was getting worse. And Japanese is a language where students often learn kanji through repeatedly writing these complicated kanji hundreds if not thousands of times. So it's completely understandable that they would feel they're not learning the words as well if they're not writing them. And Senna in an interview talked about how she was concerned that they weren't doing enough writing as well because the entrance examinations for high school are all paper-based. Looking at Makiko's students, their number 1 concern was about carrying the devices, and their number 2 concern was about how difficult it was to type. So this was a negative comment that came up from a lot of Makiko's students. I could have kept going for a long time. There were a lot of comments complaining about how heavy these devices were, how cumbersome they were. And the interesting point is the reason why Makiko's students complained about this, but Senna's students didn't, is that Makiko's students had to bring these devices home every day. That was the rule, whereas Senna's students were not allowed to bring them home, at least at the time of the study. So Makiko's students complained about having to take them home every day. However, that did mean they were able to use them to study English at home. They could do the textbook translation, they could do the PowerPoint review because they were taking these devices home every day. It really facilitated autonomy, whereas Senna's students, they only got to use these devices in the English classroom. They weren't able to review pronunciation, for example, at their own pace. So what are some of the lessons we learned? Well, there were very different teaching approaches. Senna used Google Forms, Google Jamboard, and Nearpod, and this made it much more engaging for the students. Google Forms gave them instant feedback. Google Jamboard meant they could collaborate in a new way. And then Nearpod was like a gamification of the English learning process. I wanted to show you an example of how her students used Jamboard. Now you'll see this is a group of students who are all working on the same whiteboard together, and it's really fun for them. You can see their comments in both English and Japanese where they're encouraging each other, questioning certain aspects and talking about how they should present something. And then they kind of put it together and section off, like this is your part of the script, this is your part of the script. And they have examples of the kind of language they can use for each other. And then when it came to the actual presentation, there wasn't any English text on the screen. They were just reciting from memorization and they were presenting as a group together. So it was a very dynamic approach with a lot of collaboration. Let's look at Makiko's approach next. Translation, writing, and review. And translation gave a lot of independence. Makiko was able to give them texts that were outside the textbook. And in terms of writing, they were allowed to express themselves a lot more because anything they wanted to write about, they could write about using Google Translate. And in terms of reviewing, they could check the lesson at their own pace, which was something that all contributed to fostering learner autonomy. And I wanted to show you one of the students from Makiko's class and the solo presentation that they gave on Malala. And what you'll notice is it's a really high quality PowerPoint presentation. Of course, the English is very good, but also the way it's laid out is really high quality. The timing, the pictures they've used, it's a really strong presentation. So by having time to work on this at home and by themselves, they were able to produce a really high quality piece. So very different styles, very different benefits to using Jamboard versus a solo Google Slides presentation. Another thing I learned was that teachers' use of the technology influences how students perceive the technology, not only in a positive way, but in a negative way. So when Makiko introduced these devices, she didn't have many guidelines, so the students over-relied on them. And Senna, she gave them a lot of fun activities, so her students may have thought of them as just entertainment. Makiko said, in her case, that students overly use Google Translate, and this is something that her students definitely mentioned as well. So it's very interesting that the students themselves were worried about how much they used Google Translate. Senna talked about how she was very worried about the test, and she also felt that her students were worried about the test. And this is something that Senna's students definitely mentioned in the open-ended questions. They think that using these devices doesn't help them to learn English. So, in conclusion, I talked at the beginning about how technology could facilitate a learner-centered approach or enhance a traditional teacher-centered approach. And interestingly enough, Makiko's approach was more of a learner-centered approach, whereas Senna, who was much more positive about these devices, ended up in a more traditional-centered approach. Not to say that one is necessarily better than the other, but it is interesting to note how these were very different. So how could the teachers improve for next year? Well, Makiko said they didn't really have time to think about how to use these devices. They were learning on the job. So from next time, it's better to teach the students how to use the tools appropriately. You can't really stop students from using Google Translate, but you can encourage them to use it as little as possible or to use it strategically. Whereas for Senna, she was worried that they thought Chromebooks were just for fun. She really needs to emphasize that we learn English multimodally, not just by doing writing. We learn by speaking, by collaborating in group work, and the students need to know that too. Really, it's a collective learning process. Everyone is going through around the world, and we all need to contribute to learn how best to use these devices. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to contact me, this is my email address, and you can see if you scan that QR code, it leads to the earlier publication I talked about, the earlier study about teacher preconceptions about using technology in the classroom. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.